As Boston approaches the end of its fourth century, people are coming together for the first citywide planning process in 50 years. It's called Imagine Boston 2030. The process includes a series of events for hearing what people want, whether it's housing, jobs, transportation, or open space. To continue that dialogue, there will be an open house Monday in Roxbury at the Bruce Bowling Municipal Building in Dudley Square. To bring us up to date on the initiative is its Deputy Director, John Fitzgerald. Thank you very much for being with us, John.
And thank you very much for having me.
First of all, talk about how important that is to do a planning process for the whole city all at once.
Sure. No, it's very important. It's very important to be involved as early as possible. This is the first comprehensive citywide plan in over 50 years. And what it will do is really, as a city now, we're growing and we're a booming economy. And it's how do we leverage that growth and how do we leverage that boom at this moment going forward to make sure that we are growing sustainable, we're growing healthier, we're growing more resilient, we have the housing that is needed to house the growing population of Boston. So a lot of these bigger picture questions that we're looking to sort of guide throughout this process, and hopefully have at the end have an end result that can guide us there.
Well, normal planning usually involves a particular area, or people talking about parking spaces and height.
Sure.
But I've been following some of the reports about these meetings that you've been working on, and people saying things like, "Well, we want people in Chinatown to be able to live in the city." So I mean, it could be that kind of conversation. Like that.
Yeah, it's going to be identifying areas of growth or areas of stability where we could take on more density, where we could take on more height, where we can add housing so as to sort of even out the housing, to increase the housing stock and maybe even out the price of housing for those that still want to continue to live in Boston, like myself. But also in the areas that maybe not growth, what sort of investments can be made in those areas as well, and sort of infrastructure investments and infill development and things like that. So that's sort of how the lens that we're going to look throughout the whole city. But you're right, it's tough for folks like to get down to the very granular neighborhood level when things affect them. And I think what we're looking to do, or what we want to try and do, is have folks understand this bigger picture is very important as well. And I know a lot of people can be territorial in Boston, but as a whole, as one city, this is everybody's Boston. We really want to make sure, even throughout this process, that we communicate that as one whole city. You should care, South Boston should care about what's going on in Hyde Park, and the waterfront should be accessible to those in Mattapan. Things like that will be a much stronger, more resilient, and smarter city.
Well, a conversation about housing leads to a conversation about transportation, and I think you've had some of these already, people talking about things like high-speed busways.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk out there about what can be done, and of course we know at the city level it's a little difficult to manage, being given it's a state transportation system. We want to be as helpful as possible, and we'll be working with the state and are in communication with them now about what we can do on a city level to sort of make that a better process. But yeah, there's some crazy ideas thrown out there, but we have to look at all of them because I think now is the time. If we're looking forward to where we want to be as a city in 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, the planning starts now.
Well, talk about the event that's scheduled for Monday. What's that going to be like exactly?
Sure. So it's an open house style event at the Bruce Bowling Building in Dudley Square in Roxbury. It's from 4 to 7, and it's a drop-in event. So we welcome anyone to sort of come in. And what we'll have there is we have stations set up around our 9 themes, if you will, that sort of make up the plan. And whether that be housing, mobility, land use and design, placemaking, equity, things like that. We have about 9 of them. And folks can go around, we'll have boards, we'll have information up there, we'll have folks, staff from specific departments that relate to that board. So it's really sort of a cross-departmental thing as well, which has really helped the city itself, even internally at City Hall, folks working together and communicating with one another and breaking down those silos. And people are allowed to ask questions, interact, post their ideas, and it's a very sort of open, fluid conversation that we want to have with folks.
Well, just to pick one of those silos about mobility, we've seen this already where you put down a bike lane that people have been badgering you to do for years, and then a bunch of other people come running out and say, no, we don't want that, we don't want to give up those parking spaces. Yeah. So I guess you got to sort of sift this out before it happens.
Well, what we want to do, and I think part of this engagement process too, is educating the city of Boston and the people in the city of Boston of the trade-offs that need to happen in terms of what maybe putting a bike lane in means, or what not putting in a bike lane means, and sort of some of the ramifications that maybe are a little bit longer term that people can't see right away, and then letting them decide. So I think the education is, of some of these trade-offs or ramifications or developments is an important part of this process as well. So we're going to do our best to educate as well.
Talk about the limits of this planning process, because there are some things that we'll do and some things that won't do. So try to make that distinction.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's very important to understand. And again, part of the education piece, what this does and what it doesn't do as a master plan. There's a lot of issues out there. It's not going to solve them all. We don't stake our claim in saying it's going to solve our transportation woes at the moment, or something like that. And it will not go through and do a parcel by parcel sort of rezoning of the city, which I think a lot of people think that's what it is at this point. But it is not that. It is more about identifying the areas of growth, and how can we guide that so that when the growth does occur, people know what to expect, they know where to expect it, and they understand the ramifications of that growth or non-growth in that area.
And I imagine this is something that could influence other kinds of planning in the city, because I imagine it won't be long before we're putting together a planning on new school construction, for example. So I imagine this is you got to have one looking at the other.
No, so there is actually a myriad of plans going on, and we're actually very conscious at the city of planning fatigue out there in the community, because I mean, you have a great planning process with Go Boston 2030 and the mobility project. You have Boston Creates, the arts planning. You have the school's facility master plan. You have the strategic planning areas that the BRA is doing. So there's a lot of planning going on in the city. And what Imagine Boston 2030 plans to do is weave all those plans together. There's a lot of work being done right now. We don't want to be duplicative of any work. We don't want to duplicate any. What we want to do is tie those plans that are already ongoing. Some are done. I mean, the housing plan for 2030 of 53,000 new units. Take that information and that data and that analysis and weave that into our overall plan for the city.
Well, finally, you should remind about the event on Monday, and also where people can follow this online.
Sure, yeah, again, so the event on Monday, open house at the Bruce Bowling Building from 4 to 7, and that's in Dudley Square on Washington Street. And it's a drop-in open house event, so feel free to come in. And as people can follow us, you can either email us at imagine@boston.gov. You can go to our website, imagine.boston.gov. Or you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our hashtag is, or our @ is at ImagineBoss, B-O-S.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Hey, my pleasure, Chris. Thank you so much.
John Fitzgerald from Imagine Boston 2030. In a moment, we'll hear about this year's performances of Black Nativity, but first, this message.